Good morning, everybody. Thank you for tuning into the Capitalist Cast today. We are joined by Carl Marrara from the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Carl, would you give just kind of a brief overview of what PMA does?
Sure. Thanks. And thanks so much, Leo, for having me. As Leo said, my name is Carl Marrara. I'm the Vice President of Government Affairs for the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. We're the statewide trade association representing all the different people in Pennsylvania that make the different things produced in Pennsylvania. So it's about 565,000 jobs on plant floors, but millions of additional jobs in supply chains, distribution networks, all accounting for about $93 billion in gross state product every year. And we're their eyes and ears here in Harrisburg in the state public policy process and in the political sense as well.
Yeah, and like you mentioned, we make a lot of different things in Pennsylvania, so having to try and keep track of all of the different policies is certainly basically everything from Zippos, Zippo lighters.
I usually say everything from Chinook helicopters to crayons,
Right, and that's exactly what it is. Thanks for coming on today. We wanted to have I wanted to have you on to have a conversation about the statewide election results in Pennsylvania on Tuesday, as well as some of the trends that are popping up. I guess for starters, the big races that we had in Pennsylvania were the appellate courts were the only statewide races.
Yep.
Can you talk a little bit about, I guess, first what the different appellate courts are, and then we can get into some of those results?
Sure. So, obviously the most important is the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. That's a 7-member court. And currently the structure is 5 Democrats, 2 Republicans. The Republican that was retiring, there is a 75-year age limit. So it's mandatory retirement. And Republican Thomas Saylor was retiring. And this was really an important seat on the courts for Republicans. One, because there was massive turnover in, I think it was 2015,
right,
where Democrats really took major control of that court. But 2, if Republicans didn't win a seat in this odd year election in 2021, based on the retirement ages and the way the court would be made up, there was no way Republicans could have obtained control of the Supreme Court until like 2033 or 35 or something like absolutely insane like that. So this was a really, really important seat for Republicans to win. And we had on the Democratic side, it was Maria McLaughlin, and on the Republican side, Kevin Brobson. And the polls were pretty close. Everything was within the margin of error, but it did seem as though throughout the process that Kevin Brobson was polling ahead, and that was indeed the case. I've heard a lot of things after action reports from this election, especially when you look at the statewide court races, and people saying a banner night for Republicans. I want to put a little asterisk on that. Yes, it was. It absolutely was. But we're looking at probably about total voter turnout of around 30%. Compare that to last year, which isn't abnormal and an
right.
odd, people often call this like an off cycle or off year election. As a political nerd, I like to call it like an odd year election because, every year is an in-cycle election in my opinion.
Yeah.
30% compared to in 2020 for the presidential election, over 80%. So our sample size is much smaller, but we do very obviously see a high level of Republican turnout, of Republican enthusiasm. And we can get into some of the other states that had some more robust elections, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But overall, about just shy of a 5-point victory for Kevin Brobson, and that's a pretty commanding victory. So the Pennsylvania Supreme Court is kind of the be-all, end-all for Pennsylvania state law. It's the equivalent of the U.S. Supreme Court at the federal level. There are 2 other appellate courts that make up Pennsylvania's judicial structure. The first is a superior court, and that's a mid-level appellate court. They're mainly dealing with things that deal with criminal law, and there are 15 seats on that. There are 2 that are vacant. It's under Democratic control, seven Democrats, 6 Republicans as it currently sits. There was one election for one vacancy, and Megan Sullivan won that handedly over Tamika Lane. So the Republican Megan Sullivan won that almost really a little bit above an 11-point victory. That was the highest margin of any of the statewide candidates that we saw on Tuesday night, and that was a very, very commanding win. The third is the Pennsylvania Commonwealth Court. There are 9 justices. And that one, Republicans do have control, 7 Republicans and 2 Democrats, and it's going to stay the same. But that's a mid-level appellate court, mainly dealing with issues that relate to civil and public law and governmental law. So this is a really important, going to be a very important court on things moving forward as we continue to deal with things like the COVID-19 pandemic and the laws and the rules that come from that, environmental regulations, or just really regulations in general. There were 4 candidates on the ballot. The voter could select no more than 2. There were 2 Democrats on the ticket, 2 Republicans on the ticket. Stacey Wallace and Drew Crompton were the 2 Republicans, and they were the 2 that were ultimately victorious. Neither one of the Democratic candidates got above 22.5%. Those were the makeup of the courts. There were a few folks on the courts that were running for retention. These are almost always a yes vote.
Right.
I actually don't even believe that they list the political party of those judges running for retention. But I will say this. Not one of, and I need to go back and look at this in previous years, because I was a little bit surprised that none of the people running for retention got more than 65% of the vote. And to me, that just indicates that incumbency doesn't mean anything right now.
Yeah. I mean, it used to be, those numbers used to be it used to be like an 80-20. Over time, we've certainly seen the power of incumbency as it relates to the courts really meaning a lot less.
Yeah.
That the number of people who are looking at it and saying, you've been there for 10 years, that's enough. Let's get somebody else in there. It has increased over time.
Absolutely.
So I'll be curious to see what happens, really going forward, if that trend continues and it starts to become more of an issue where, judges really don't know if they're going to be retained after 10 years or not.
And judicial elections in Pennsylvania are just a little bit odd to begin with. I mean, one, the fact that we elect our judges at all is something that is unique amongst state. It's not every state does it that way.
Right.
Of the states that do elect their judges, Pennsylvania is again unique in that we actually do assign political parties to it. That is certainly not the case in many other states. And that the same campaign rules really apply to the judicial elections as do for general elections for state candidates, and that there really aren't spending limits and contribution limits and those types of things. So, it is a little bit of a unique case amongst other states. And, I do think that, and again, I need to go back and look at some of the different trends, but these were pretty expensive races, especially at the Supreme Court level for a court race. And, but with that, we saw what we're thinking is going to be just over 30% voter turnout, which in an odd cycle year is pretty high. The other thing that I will mention, Leo, really quickly, is that there were 2 special elections, 2 vacant Pennsylvania House seats. The first was Pennsylvania 113, which is Marty Flynn's old seat. He won a special election and is now the senator representing that same area up in Lackawanna County. And Democrats won that seat at 69% to 27.5%. Tom Welby was the Democrat running there, and he was successful. Interestingly, those numbers are almost identical to Marty Flynn's last House race in 2020 to hold that same seat. And in the PA 164th, That's Margot Davison's old seat, who's dealing with charges with stealing state funds and misuse of campaign funds, and that whole thing is a giant mess. Gina Curry, the Democrat, won 78% of the vote there to Brian Taylor's 19%. That's usually an uncontested district. I don't know that Margot Davidson had an opponent, but since like 2014 or something like that. So
yeah, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't Representative Davison like the second or third person in that seat who had been convicted of a crime in recent history, or charged with criminal activity in recent history? I mean, that.
I'm honestly, I'm not sure. That very well could be the case. There's been a number of I mean, what is it? Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely. Whenever you're dealing with seats where you're never even dealing with a primary challenger, let alone a challenge, from the other side of the aisle in any of those races, it's ripe for corruption, and certainly that was the case in the 164th.
Yeah, it's fascinating just to kind of watch, and also horrifying at the same time.
Yes.
Just the sheer volume of elected officials and regulatory officials in Pennsylvania who find themselves in prison at some point. But on a completely unrelated note, you had mentioned that we're looking at about a 30% turnout as far as the election is concerned, which is, as a top line number, pretty much in line with what we expect. It's a little higher than what it was, a couple of years ago, but it's not an abnormally high turnout for an odd year election.
Right.
What is interesting, though, is the composition when you kind of drill into those numbers a little bit more as to what parts of the state really made up that, where those votes were coming from.
Yeah, this is something we're going to be looking at for a while, and there's really no easy answer. And what I suspect is that, we know out of Philadelphia that the voting numbers were fairly low. Probably closer to 20% than the overall state average of 30%. And, parts of rural Pennsylvania, we saw a much higher percentage. And so the obvious question is why? And a lot of times too, especially 2020, what we saw was top down, that we saw a lot of people coming out to vote for the very top of the ticket in the presidential election. And then that led to some shifts and changes in the political the political makeup of our different institutions because of how that went down ballot. People, just plugging either Democrat the whole way down or plugging Republican the whole way down. I think we actually had the inverse in 2021. I think that the main driver, at least in Pennsylvania, in those rural areas where we saw higher voter turnout, it was likely because of contentious school board votes. So that's the very bottom of the ticket, our school board races. There were a number of major write-in school board races, a lot of like last-minute challenges, just the way that different school districts have either handled policies relating to the pandemic, some of the different content areas that school boards have different opinions on, and it's led to a lot of activism, and it's led to a lot of campaigning all the way down the ballot. And what happens, in my opinion, is that high vote turnout in those rural areas for those school board races then trickled up tickets. So in order to get there, you had to go check all the boxes to get to that very last box for school board. And while there might be infighting amongst Democrats, while there might be infighting amongst Republicans on some of those down ballot of, are you conservative enough? Are you, somebody that I think is a rhino on the school board? Or conversely, are you, just a liberal mouthpiece, or do you actually believe in progressive politics when it comes to school board? It was unified at the top of the ticket. You're not going to write in a Supreme Court nominee. You're going, but for the school board, there is division there. There are people that are really passionate about their campaigns, driving people out to the polls that then happen to vote at the top of the ticket.
And I would tend to agree with you. There were, I know locally where I live, there was more activity related to the local school board race, and that's, write-in campaigns and a
Mhm.
variety of other things, and more than I've seen in the 20 years that I've lived in the area. And of
Or
course,
a
these aren't
township supervisor was a big one.
right.
One of the races that was actually a really hotly contested race and got some national attention in Pennsylvania was the Erie County executive race. And the
Yeah,
Republican, the Republican there won a very slim margin. But that got a lot of national attention because the opponent was part of the LGBTQ community, got a lot of national money, and that was one that was very, very hotly contested. Had a lot of eyes on it, and I believe that the Republican that won there, that's the first Republican county executive for Erie County in the last 20 years. So, I mean, if you're looking at different trends, if you're looking at especially Erie had become a focal point in the 2020
right.
presidential
Yep,
election,
I was just going to mention that.
and certainly was a major factor in 2016. So you've got some different political dynamics happening there.
It is interesting because there is, as you were mentioning Erie, there's been that it really has become, the county itself has certainly become more of a swing county in the traditional sense than what we've seen. I don't know, historically is the right word, but what we've seen more recently has been a lot more back and forth in terms of which party is winning within the county, and the fact that, as you mentioned, the county executive, which is Erie County, for people who aren't familiar, operate under a home rule charter. So the county executive works along with essentially like a county council. It's a slightly different setup than
Right.
most counties that have like a county commissioners, county commissioners who decide policy. It's a slightly different model for governing.
Let me
But
say
it's
this too, just up the lake, and I know we're going to get into some of the other states, but an interesting race was actually the mayor of Buffalo, so kind of just up the lake from Erie, right?
right.
And let's put it this way. I mean, yes, it was. I mean, a lot of Republicans are celebrating a victory on Tuesday. I think a lot of it points to the infighting amongst the Democratic Party, that there's, I think, a major, major division that they're going to need to address between what I would view as kind of an anti-production type of message, where it's a lot of environmental extremism versus what used to be the bread and butter of the Democratic Party, and that's kind of the union, the foundation of the working class. And I mean, there's a lot of infighting going on there. Was it a bad night to be a Democrat? Maybe not. Was it a bad night to be a progressive, like an ultra progressive Democrat? Absolutely. And that is absolutely evident in the mayor or the Buffalo mayor's race. So this was between India Walton, who's a Democratic socialist, and then the incumbent Byron Brown. And India Walton actually beat Byron Brown in the primary, but Byron Brown ran a very aggressive write-in campaign, and the Democratic Socialist candidate, India Walton, lost handedly, almost 20 points. Now they're going to have to go through and look at all the write-ins, make sure the names all match up, but it's very clear that Byron Brown is going to hold on to his mayoral seat, and that the Democratic Socialist candidate in Buffalo is going to lose. And that's an indication that that wing of the party is causing major problems for the party in general.
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring that up, the kind of that blue collar value piece, and I don't want to necessarily get into a lot of 2022 stuff as it relates to Pennsylvania specifically, but what we saw recently was one of the issues that is going to be dramatically affecting manufacturing in Pennsylvania is Governor Wolf's decision to try and join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which has been really, the regional greenhouse gas initiative will be very hostile to blue collar labor.
That's putting it
Because
mildly. It will put them
yeah,
out of work.
yeah, it will put a lot of blue collar workers out of a job. What we saw recently was Josh Shapiro, who's been running for governor, I think, since kindergarten, is came out and said that he would not support our entry into the regional greenhouse gas initiative if he was governor. So where it gets interesting is that as attorney general, there are things that he can do to stymie the governor's efforts to do that. He's kind of just speaking the words and not actually doing anything with it at this point. So I'll be curious to see what happens. He's taking a very, I would call it a low risk position, and he's saying something in order to placate private sector unions, whereas he's not actually doing anything to prevent a bad policy from taking place.
Yeah, I mean, we could spend a whole half-hour program on this topic alone. But yeah, he absolutely is going to have the opportunity to do something. We're currently in the legislative process with different joint resolutions, and there's also standalone legislation that would, what we think would solidify the legislature's role in this, and they should have a role to begin with. But Attorney General Shapiro is going to have an opportunity to either approve or deny the regulation for its constitutionality. And we think there's a number of constitutional violations.
Right.
And we pointed those out. If anybody who's viewing this, you can go to www.powerpajobs.com and learn a lot more on this topic. But I mean, that is absolutely something that will be a focal point of the campaign for governor. And at like 10:30 at night on Tuesday, Attorney General Shapiro tweeted out that if you have this sick feeling in the pit of your stomach, now is the time to donate to the Democratic Party for 2022. So that really kind of sums up all that you need to know about election night 2021 in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, exactly. So we don't get too far off track. We were talking before we started, and you had an interesting opportunity to have some discussions yesterday with your counterparts in some other states. Anybody who has been watching the news or been online or conscious over the last 48 hours has heard about some of the things that have happened in Virginia and maybe to a lesser extent New Jersey, depending upon where you're at in the state. I guess the first thing, one of the interesting ones that popped out at me, and I guess we can start, let's quickly touch on New Jersey just because it's our neighbor. Right. One of the things that popped out at me that I thought was fascinating was it looks like the president pro tempore of the Senate in New Jersey was almost beaten by, or potentially was.
No, I think he's going. I absolutely do think he's going to lose.
A gentleman who spent like $153 campaigning, and he's a truck driver, not a politician.
Edward Durr, a truck driver. He spent $153 on his race against the Senate President Steve Sweeney. Steve Sweeney is the longest serving legislator in New Jersey's two-system General Assembly. Somebody who is probably going to be viewed as a potential candidate for a U.S. Senate seat or a potential future gubernatorial seat. So last count that I saw, and that was as of this morning, that Edward Durr was about 2,000 votes ahead.
And that's just, I love seeing those kinds of things just because, that disruption of the status quo is fascinating whenever it happens, but it was just such a lopsided and interesting. Now, I don't know that we can necessarily draw broader based conclusions from that, but it's still just fascinating to look at.
Well, and here's the thing. I mean, look at the gubernatorial race. I mean, Phil Murphy was supposed to run, 8-10 points ahead of Jack Ciattarelli. I'm not even sure, many of the Republicans in New Jersey even knew how to say Ciattelli's last name before they walked into the polls, but he wasn't Phil Murphy.
Right.
So like, I just think that this was an instance where you really kind of look at what we kind of started talking about the program with, was that anti-incumbency, just with everything that's going on. Are any of these issues any one person, any one party's fault? Probably not. But the current trends in American politics right now is, kind of blame the top. I absolutely do think that New Jersey's election results are an indication that Democrats nationally should be worried, because things aren't getting better as they promised to do in the 2020 election. The supply chains are a mess. The economy is not doing well. I mean, if you're looking at your stock portfolio, it hasn't done anything. All we see are help wanted signs, and people are just, I think people just feel inconvenienced, and they feel like government isn't doing anything to help. And I think that's especially true in New Jersey. And that's what we saw. Phil Murphy just squeaked by, barely. The New Jersey General Assembly didn't change a ton, but it did change. I mean, they were basically at supermajorities before. The New Jersey State Senate was at 25-15. Now it's 22-18. The General Assembly was 52-28, and I think there was like a five-seat swing there. So they did lose a few seats, not a ton. But then when you look, and I don't mean to like kind of steal your thunder here, but when you look at Virginia and what happened,
yeah, that's a perfect segue into it.
Virginia has a similar structure in New Jersey. They have two chambers. Their lower chamber had a difference of a swing of 7 seats. So it went from Democratic control to Republican control. So 52-48, it is now in Republican control. And down the entire top of the ballot, Terry McAuliffe lost. Glenn Youngkin won by about 2 points. And then the other,
which was a 12-point swing from the presidential cycle.
Correct.
Going
correct.
from 10 points for Biden.
Biden carried Virginia at 10 points. With 10 points. But it went all the way down ballot. The attorney general of Virginia, Mark Herring, lost to Jason Marias, and that's a big deal. And that was a 1-point victory. That said, it did follow the trend that actually Mark Herring was seeking a third term as Virginia Attorney General, and that hadn't been done since 1947. So but it is noticeable, I think that it's important to note that that was a seat that I'm not sure Republicans there thought that they were going to take. I'm not sure any of them were ones that they thought ultimately that they were going to take. But you're going to have a Republican governor of Virginia with a split General Assembly. That the Senate of Virginia does still have Democratic control, though they do have it's very slim at 19-21 in the Senate. And there is a Democrat in the Senate that only votes with their caucus about 60-ish% of the time. So dynamics in Virginia are going to be quite weird for at least the next 2 years.
And they're, if I'm not mistaken, their lieutenant governor also serves as the president pro tempore of the Senate. So
I believe so, and that was Republican elected as well.
Yeah, in theory, you could see some 50-50 votes decided by the lieutenant governor and the Democrat who is less inclined to vote with the caucus than still a majority of the time voting with the caucus, but not a guarantee.
But ultimately, why are we talking about Virginia? Why are we talking about New Jersey? Well, they're the only ones that have this odd cycle election with governors, with their General Assembly. But it's often a bellwether for what's happening nationally. And, Virginia typically votes for governor, the party opposite of whoever's in the White House. There's another state that tends to do that too, and that's the other Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. So I think that Democrats in Pennsylvania are any Democrat that's telling you in Pennsylvania that they're not concerned or they're not looking at the results in Virginia are lying.
Exactly.
They absolutely are. And it's if that's not a sampling for what could be to come in Pennsylvania, I'm not quite sure what is. Because certainly the polls aren't right.
Yeah, getting the polling, that's a whole, we could have a whole other show about the polling discrepancies with, trying to get accurate data versus, what the outcome and everything is.
Why you play the game.
Yeah, exactly. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming on today and talking with us. Not only about the results of the Pennsylvania election, but about some of the other results nearby that we might be able to glean some information from as we go into next year, into Pennsylvania's not just gubernatorial and U.S. Senate races, but we're also going to have brand new legislative districts in the House and Senate because of redistricting.
Yep.
So while these conversations are obviously a little bit wonky because that's what we do, it's good to be able to take a look at it and try and figure out, okay, what might this portend, if things stay as they are by the time we get to next November.
Yep.
I mean, that's a big question mark. Will things stay as they are until next November? But it's interesting to be able to take a look at it and say, okay, kind of given this snapshot in time, what are the things that people are really concerned about, and how can that come back into what's happening here in our Commonwealth, and what are we looking at going forward? So again, thank you very much, Carl, for coming on today. If anybody
Thanks for
wants
having
to
me. I
learn,
appreciate it.
absolutely. If anybody wants to learn more about the PA Manufacturers Association, what's the website address?
PAmanufacturers.org, and we're all over Facebook and Twitter. And again, I know you alluded to Reggie earlier on that issue. PowerPAjobs.com.
Yeah, the PowerPAjobs.com is a ongoing issue, and that's going to be something that if you do not want higher electric bills, that's going to be something that you want to pay attention to if it's not on your radar already.
Very much.
Thanks everybody for tuning in and watching us today, and we look forward to talking to you again in the future. Enjoy the rest of your day.